Imagine a political party demanding that peaceful climate protesters spend 4 to 5 years in a maximum security prison.
Right.
Now, hold that thought and consider this. 4 to 5 years is actually a longer sentence than the average time currently served in the UK for, armed robbery or arson or even violent assault.
Yeah, which is pretty staggering when you really think about it.
Exactly. So is that just, tough on crime conservatism?
Mm.
Or is it the flashing red warning light of an authoritarian far-right movement?
I mean, that is the exact tension tearing through the political landscape right now. Because when you start advocating for state power to be used disproportionately against political dissidents, while giving actual violent crime a sort of lighter statistical touch, you cross a line.
Right.
But figuring out exactly where that line is drawn, well, that's where the real fight happens.
Okay, let's unpack this because that fight is our entire focus today. Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really comprehensive Substack article by Roderick McMillan, and it's titled, "The Truth About Reform, Are They Far Right?"
Yeah, and it's a fascinating piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
But, and this is crucial, we are also looking at a fiercely dissenting counterargument from one of his readers, a guy named Simon V.
Right, the comment section actually adds a ton of value here.
Oh, absolutely. Now look, a quick disclaimer for you listening right now. Because we are dealing with highly polarized left and right perspectives today, our job isn't to be a referee.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to pick a side. We are purely acting as auditors. We're just laying out the academic frameworks, the polling data, and the fierce pushback from voters impartially.
Yeah, we're essentially looking at how this ideological turf war is being fought right there on the page. We aren't endorsing either view.
Exactly. We just want to give you the context.
And it is a really critical audit because
Yeah.
the core mystery Macmillan is trying to solve isn't just about one British political party.
Right.
It's really about language. Like, how do we objectively define far right? Does Reform UK actually fit a clinical academic definition? Or, and this is what a lot of people argue, is that label just a convenient political smear designed to, silence uncomfortable debate?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really stick a label on something until you define what the label actually means.
Exactly.
So the author anchors his entire argument on this framework built by a political scientist named Cas Mudde.
Right, who is essentially the godfather of extremism studies.
Yeah, but Mudde makes a distinction that I think a lot of people miss.
Yeah.
He completely separates the extreme right from the radical right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that distinction totally changes how we view modern politics.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the extreme right is historically pretty simple to identify. They reject the concept of democracy entirely.
Like your 1930s fascists.
Exactly. They view elections as a weakness. They want totalitarian control. But the radical right operates in a completely different mechanism. They actually love elections, they want to participate, and they really want to win the popular vote. What they oppose, though, are the fundamental protections of liberal democracy.
Meaning they accept the vote, but they reject the constitutional speed bumps.
That's the exact mechanics of it, yeah. They believe that if they win 51% of the vote, they have a mandate to impose their will entirely.
With no limits.
Exactly. Without being restrained by the separation of powers or an independent judiciary or, constitutional protections for the 49% who voted against them.
Wow.
Yeah, they basically want the mechanics of democracy without the liberal safeguards.
The author actually uses this really striking wine analogy here, which I loved.
Oh, yeah, the Pinot Noir thing.
Yeah. He argues that denying a political party is far right just because they aren't marching in jackboots or wearing swastikas is like a Pinot Noir denying it's a red wine just because it's not a Merlot.
Right.
Like, they might be different varietals, fermented in slightly different ways for different eras, but they share the exact same underlying DNA.
And according to Mudde's framework, that DNA consists of 4 specific pillars.
Okay, what are they?
Nativism, authoritarianism, populism, and a rejection of pluralism.
Okay, hold on, though. Checking boxes on a rubric in a university office is one thing, but aren't we just kind of pathologizing normal right-wing politics here?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, stiff sentences and strict borders have been mainstream conservative policy since, the 1980s.
Hmm.
If we use this academic definition, isn't it incredibly easy to just diagnose anything right of center as a radical threat?
Right, and that is the exact pushback the author anticipates, which is why he moves from the abstract theory directly into the empirical evidence of Reform UK's rhetoric. And he starts with that first pillar, nativism.
Right, nativism.
Because nativism isn't just about wanting lower immigration. Mechanically, it's the belief that the state should be inhabited exclusively by the native group,
Okay.
and that any non-native elements, whether that's people or ideas, are fundamentally threatening to the nation's survival.
Yeah, and Macmillan points a lot of fingers at the rhetoric of Nigel Farage to prove this.
Oh, for sure.
Like, he brings up Farage's infamous breaking point poster
Yeah.
from the Brexit campaign. The one showing that massive queue of Syrian refugees.
Right, that was a huge moment.
But he actually goes further into a specific radio interview, and this is wild. Farage suggested people should be more concerned about having a group of Romanian men move in next door than they would be if those neighbors were Germans.
Yeah, and the author isolates that specific moment because it exposes the mechanism of hierarchical sorting.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, if immigration concerns were purely about civic capacity like housing shortages or hospital wait times, the nationality of the immigrant wouldn't matter at all.
Oh, right, because a German neighbor takes up the exact same amount of housing as a Romanian one.
Exactly. So by explicitly drawing a line between desirable Western Europeans and undesirable Eastern Europeans, the author argues Farage is leaning heavily into ethnic stereotyping rather than just civic policy.
Okay, that makes sense. And this ties into a concept from the text that I found incredibly revealing, which is welfare chauvinism.
Yes, welfare chauvinism is perhaps the most potent psychological tool the radical right possesses today.
Really? How so?
Historically, the far right wanted to completely dismantle the welfare state, but the modern radical right realized that's actually wildly unpopular with voters.
Because people like their benefits.
Exactly. So they flip the script. Now, they support state benefits, housing, and social safety nets, but they argue those things must be restricted exclusively to the native in-group.
Wow, so it weaponizes middle-class economic anxiety.
Totally.
Because if public services are failing, it's complicated and honestly boring to blame an aging population or stagnant tax policies.
Right. Nobody wants to hear about tax policy.
Right.
Right.
But welfare chauvinism offers a highly visible outgroup as a scapegoat. It frames the native population as hardworking and deserving, while casting the immigrant as parasitic, draining the resources that rightfully belong to you.
Exactly. But here is the catch, and this provides the logical bridge to the second pillar.
Okay.
You cannot enforce strict nativist policies like mass deportations or heavily policed borders or stripping away welfare from specific groups without a massive escalation in state power.
Oh, you need a hammer.
You need a huge hammer, and that's where the party's stance on law and order takes a sharp turn into authoritarianism.
Right, which brings us all the way back to that staggering statistic about the climate protesters from the intro.
Yeah, the Just Stop Oil protests.
Yeah. Reform UK officially advocates for a massive expansion of zero-tolerance policing. Richard Tice, who's a senior party figure, literally demanded those peaceful protesters serve 4 to 5 years in jail.
Right.
But the text points out a glaring contradiction here. Because when farmers use highly disruptive, financially damaging protest tactics to fight inheritance taxes, Nigel Farage vocally supported them.
And see, that contradiction is the defining feature of authoritarianism.
Really?
Yeah, because they don't actually believe in a universal, impartial application of law and order.
Right.
Right.
They believe in using state power to crush dissent from outgroups they dislike, while totally protecting and encouraging disruptions that align with their own political goals. The law basically becomes a weapon for the in-group, not a universal standard.
Okay, I hear that, but I'm still not buying that this fully crosses the line into far-right territory.
Fair enough.
I mean, wanting the police to crack down on protesters who block highways while supporting farmers who literally feed the country, that could just be seen as traditional, albeit aggressive, conservative values. Where does the data actually show this moving into extremism?
Well, the author turns to the polling data of the party's own supporters to answer that.
Okay, let's look at the numbers.
There was a Hope Not Hate poll that surveyed Reform UK voters, and it found that 77% want to reinstate the death penalty.
Wow!
But more critically, for the academic framework we're discussing, 53% of their voters explicitly stated they want a strong leader who has the power to ignore or override Parliament entirely. Wait, over half of their base actively wants to bypass the elected legislature.
Yes. So they aren't just asking for tougher laws. They are expressing a really deep psychological frustration with the friction of democracy itself.
Right.
They want to dismantle the democratic checks and balances that prevent immediate, forceful action.
But, I mean, to convince voters that bypassing Parliament is a good idea, you first have to convince them that Parliament is completely illegitimate.
Exactly.
Which leads us directly into the third pillar, populism.
Yes. Populism is the engine that drives this whole narrative. It demands that society be divided into two entirely antagonistic camps.
Right, us versus them.
Exactly. On one side, you have the pure, virtuous, ordinary citizens, and on the other, you have a devious, corrupt, globalist elite.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The author points out the supreme irony of Reform UK's corporate mechanics.
Oh, this is fascinating.
It's wild. They pitch themselves as a grassroots, populist insurgency against the out-of-touch establishment. Yet the party is led by a millionaire ex-banker. It's bankrolled by aristocrats. And structurally, get this, it was set up like a private limited company where Nigel Farage was the majority shareholder.
Yeah, that is true.
It literally lacked the internal democratic structures of a normal political party. It was top-down, corporate ownership, masquerading as a populist uprising.
It is a massive paradox. But the reason that populist narrative still works so effectively is that it taps into genuine systemic disenfranchisement.
Right. People actually are struggling.
Exactly. People feel ignored by traditional institutions, so they're totally willing to overlook the wealth of the populist leader if that leader promises to act as a battering ram against the establishment.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The danger Macmillan highlights, though, is that this anti-elite sentiment requires constant fuel, and that fuel frequently morphs into full-blown conspiracy theories.
Yeah, the article cites this investigation into unmoderated Facebook groups run by reform organizers. And we aren't talking about, like, mild skepticism of government spending here.
No, not at all.
You have actual party candidates sharing theories about microchips being put into vaccines for global depopulation.
Yeah.
You have rampant discussions of the Great Replacement Theory, which is that violently racist idea that shadowy elites are intentionally importing non-white immigrants to replace native Britons.
And while the official party spokespeople might use more, coded language like railing against globalists or cultural Marxists, the author argues that by failing to proactively police these conspiracies within their ranks, the leadership creates a permission structure.
Right, they look the other way.
Exactly. They signal to extremists that these views are, at the very least, tolerable within the movement.
Which bleeds directly into Mudde's fourth and final pillar, the rejection of pluralism.
Yes, and pluralism is the bedrock of liberal democracy. It's the basic acknowledgement that a healthy society contains diverse groups with competing interests, and that minority rights must be legally protected from the tyranny of the majority.
And Macmillan points to Reform UK's flagship policy as the ultimate rejection of this. They promised to completely withdraw the UK from the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yeah, they argue the convention restricts their sovereignty and stops them from deporting people.
But the historical irony here is almost unbelievable.
Oh, about who wrote it?
Yes. The article notes who originally drafted the European Convention on Human Rights. It wasn't some radical leftist academic. It was a British conservative lawyer and MP named Sir David Maxwell Fyfe.
Right.
He was the man who literally prosecuted the Nazis at the Nuremberg trials.
It's amazing history.
Right. He helped draft these universal human rights protections specifically to prevent the kind of state tyranny he had just finished prosecuting. And now, a supposedly patriotic party wants to rip up his legacy.
And for Macmillan, this is the clearest indicator of their far-right nature. The mechanism is simple. They are willing to sacrifice universal human rights to achieve an exclusionary national vision.
Wow.
And this hostility extends to democratic norms as well. The text highlights Farage's habit of crying foul and questioning election results, specifically in places like Oldham, Peterborough, and Rochdale whenever his party loses. And he does this despite offering zero evidence of systemic fraud.
Oh, it's the ultimate populist catch-22.
Yeah.
If the quote-unquote will of the people didn't win the election, well, then the mechanics of the election must be rigged.
Exactly.
So, based on Macmillan's academic audit, Reform UK hits every single marker. Nativism, authoritarianism, populism, and anti-pluralism.
They checked all the boxes.
But the party violently rejects this label. And some readers push back incredibly hard against the entire premise of this diagnosis. So let's look at the counterarguments.
Well, the party's official defense relies on demonstrating mainstream integration.
Okay, how do they do that?
To counter claims of structural racism or Islamophobia, they point out that they recently appointed a Muslim chairman, Zia Yusuf,
Right.
and Nigel Farage consistently insists they are simply a party of common sense. Furthermore, they point out that during their vetting process, they proactively dropped over 100 problematic candidates.
Ah, so they're cleaning house.
Right. Their argument is essentially the bad apple defense. They say, look, every large organization attracts a few extremists, but by throwing them out, the party is proving its mainstream credentials.
Right. But the most devastating defense in the source material doesn't actually come from the party itself. It comes from the comments section.
Ah, Simon V.
Yes. A reader named Simon V. wrote a fierce rebuttal to Macmillan's entire article. And Simon doesn't even bother defending individual party policies. He attacks the underlying academic framework itself. He argues that Cas Mudde's pillars are just a bias trap.
Yeah, Simon's argument is very structural. He claims this definition is weaponized by authoritarian leftists. He argues that the academic criteria are drawn so broadly that any right-of-center party that criticizes mass migration or rejects multiculturalism or opposes positive discrimination, they just get automatically sucked into the far-right vortex.
Yeah, Simon asks a brilliant, piercing question to the author.
Yeah.
He essentially says, show me a right-wing political program on migration and culture that is distinctly different from left-wing policies, but isn't classified as far-right by your rubric.
It's a great challenge.
It is. And Simon concludes the answer is zero. There's no room in this academic framework for normal, conservative pushback against liberal policies.
This raises an important question, and it's perhaps the most critical concept for anyone analyzing politics today. The manipulation of the Overton window.
The Overton window. Let's define that.
It's basically the conceptual range of ideas that are tolerated in mainstream public discourse at any given time.
Okay, let's use a mechanical analogy here to explain Simon's point. He is basically arguing that this academic framework acts like a political camera aperture.
Oh, I like that.
Right. So the cultural left controls the dial, and they keep shrinking the aperture, letting less and less light in. Eventually, the aperture gets so small that any normal conservative policy is left out in the dark, labeled as extreme and totally dismissed.
Right.
By calling voters extremists, you don't even have to debate the merits of their arguments. You just excommunicate them from polite society. It's a mechanism of boundary policing.
And it is a highly effective counterargument because it validates the exact feeling of alienation that drives populist movements in the first place.
That feeling of being talked down to.
Exactly, the feeling of being condescended to by intellectual elites. But Macmillan has a rebuttal for this defense, and he doesn't just rely on abstract academic theory. He points to the reality of public perception.
Right. The polling data. Macmillan references a nationwide Hope Not Hate poll conducted by Focal Data, and it found that over 60% of the British public already agree that Reform UK is a far-right populist party.
Right.
His argument is that this isn't just a few rogue academics shrinking the camera aperture. It's the wisdom of the crowd. The majority of the public recognizes the underlying DNA of the party's rhetoric.
And Macmillan aggressively dismantles the bad apples defense regarding those 100 dropped candidates.
Oh, yeah. How does he tackle that?
His argument focuses on the mechanism of ideological gravity. He points out that it is not normal for a mainstream political party to accidentally attract hundreds of neo-Nazis, conspiracy theorists, and white nationalists who feel totally comfortable running for office under that specific banner.
Right. His point is that if you constantly have to throw out rotten apples, at some point, you have to admit you are intentionally feeding people from a rotten barrel.
Exactly.
The sheer volume of extremists trying to join the party indicates a systemic value overlap. The extremists hear the dog whistles loud and clear, even if the party leadership claims they are just, playing a regular flute.
So we are left with this profound ideological standoff. We have the academic diagnosis claiming the party hits all 4 radical markers. We have public polling backing up that diagnosis.
Yeah.
But we also have a party aggressively denying it, and millions of voters arguing that the diagnosis itself is a rigged game designed to pathologize conservative thought and silence legitimate debate.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you spend time understanding the academic classification of one British political party?
Because this is not an isolated local phenomenon. The exact same systemic mechanisms we unpack today are driving political shifts globally.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. Whether you are watching the National Rally in France, the AfD in Germany, the Magia movement in the United States, or Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil, the blueprint is identical.
Yeah, this deep dive gives you the tools to audit those movements yourself. When you hear a politician speak, you can now look past the surface-level anger and identify the actual mechanics at play. Are they utilizing welfare chauvinism to weaponize economic anxiety? Are they demanding authoritarian state power to crush specific outgroups? Are they using populism to bypass democratic friction? It forces you to constantly ask whether the far-right labels being used are accurate clinical diagnoses of a threat to pluralism or just political weapons used to police the boundaries of debate.
And that leads to a final, slightly unsettling thought I want to leave you with. Based on the historical timeline of this movement that Macmillan maps out in his text,
Okay, let's hear it.
Reform UK didn't just manifest out of thin air. The article shows that it is a highly adaptable evolutionary rebrand.
Right.
First, this exact political energy formed UKIP, which successfully dragged the mainstream political conversation toward Brexit.
Right.
Once that was achieved, UKIP mutated into the Brexit Party to finish that specific legislative job. When Brexit was done, the exact same leadership, the same populist energy, and the same donor base mutated once again into Reform UK to capitalize on post-COVID anti-establishment anxieties.
It functions exactly like a biological organism, constantly adapting to survive in a shifting environment.
Precisely. So here's the question to ponder as you watch global politics unfold. If populist movements act like evolving organisms, and this current far-right label eventually becomes too toxic for Reform UK to survive in its current form, what happens next? What new, highly mutated version of this political DNA might emerge in 5 or 10 years to capture the next wave of electorate anxiety? And honestly, will our academic frameworks even be able to recognize it before it takes hold?